welcome everyone to H. France's first webinar. It's with great pleasure that I introduce Lynn Hunt, Distinguished Professor of History, who holds the Eugene Weber Endowed Chair in Modern European History at UCLA. Her contributions to the study of 18th century France, and especially the French Revolution, not to mention her many interventions and discussions about how to do history, are many. There are too many to enumerate here. Allow me just to touch upon the main contributions. Lynn has always been a pioneer. In her first book, Revolution and Urban Politics in Provincial France, she offered a comparative local study of two cities, Troyes and Reims, between 1786 and 1790. In doing so, she pushed historians to move away from deducing the French Revolution from social and economic structures to seeing politics as a historical force in its own right. She became famous with her next book, where many of us are familiar with, probably all of us, Politics, Culture, and Class in the French Revolution. Here she expanded on the category of politics, treating it as a dynamic force with its own cultural logic. She put political culture at the center of historical analysis and encouraged historians to turn their attention to collective rhetoric and symbols. Still, she did not dissolve political culture entirely into language. She tethered rhetoric and symbols to the emergence of a new and concrete political class. In the 1990s, she broke new ground with the family romance of the French Revolution, and this study picked up on and expanded on, actually, an aspect of her previous book, how mental and psychological phenomena, what's in your head, take concrete social and political form. Drawing on the insights of Sigmund Freud and René Girard, she showed how the experience of revolution destabilized people's psychic structure, which was based on the family. The results of this psychic disturbance fed back into politics, structuring revolutionary action and the meanings assigned to it. After co-authoring and editing textbooks and a work on pornography in the 18th century and books about even beyond that, and books about historical methods, Lynn turned her attention to human rights. Her reflection culminated in her 2007 book, Inventing Human Rights. Again, she took the psyche as her starting point. Rather than locating the origins of human rights in philosophy or legal traditions, as most scholars have, she showed how human rights, as a set of values thought to be universal in scope, grew out of the development of the individual's interiority, emotions, and capacity to empathize. Most recently, Lynn has been turning her attention to global history and the transnational financial origins of the French Revolution, which we'll talk about shortly. We've chosen three texts to focus on today. An essay by Lynn on the French Revolution in global context, an essay by Suzanne Defan on transatlantic spaces of revolution, the French Revolution, how do you pronounce that? Utopianism, and the American lands. And finally, we have William Max Nelson's recent essay in the AHR, Making Men Enlightenment Ideas of Racial Engineering. So Lynn will start us off with a brief talk about the French global history and thoughts on how to do it and its importance. And after that, we will take questions and begin the discussion.
All right, two quick notes. Lynn, before you go, two quick notes.
Yes.
Can you lower your microphone a little bit? I think we're getting your breathing.
Well, I don't want that. Is that better?
That is better. And second, for everybody, you will notice where the participant box is on the left-hand side of the main screen. There's the little hand with an arrow next to it. And if you have a question, want to make a comment, all you'll need to do is click that, and that will raise your hand, and then Chuck and I can address, put you in line to make your comment or ask your question. Thanks.
I know a lot of people have questions, comments, and things they would like to say, So I'm not going to take terribly much time, but I want to start first by thanking really incredibly heartily David Smith and his whole team at Eastern Illinois, because I know this has been, full of hassles and ups and downs and obstacles to be overcome. And we're all really grateful to you, David, and to all the people who are working with you to make this possible. I also want to especially thank Chuck Walton, who came up with the ideas for the readings and has played a really important role in getting this off the ground. And then finally, of course, I want to thank Suzanne Desson and William Nelson, because their articles are really crucial to this discussion. So there are two big questions, which I'm actually not going to answer, but I'll throw them out there because I think we might want to discuss them. And they are, first, why are we interested in the global or the transnational now? It's not as if globalization started 10 or 20 years ago. One could argue it's been going on forever. And I'm not sure there's a clear answer to that question, but I thought I'd throw it out there if people would like to discuss it. Perhaps the more pertinent question for today is, how does it affect French history? I think French history is, in many ways, undergoing something of a transformation because of the interest in the global and the transnational. And I think the best examples, or the best ways of getting at an answer to this question, is looking at some examples. And the articles by Suzanne Desson on Ciotomanie or Ciotomania, and William Nelson's article on eugenics or proto-eugenics in Saint-Domingue, I think really get us off to a start on that. So I want to say a little bit about those articles. I'll start first by just saying two sentences about my own piece. My interest is not just in a kind of global perspective on the French Revolution, but especially in how a global perspective can change our understanding of the French Revolution itself. Everyone knows the French Revolution had a global impact, or at least they know something about its global impact. What's less clear is whether this has any impact on the revolution as it unfolds in what we call France, that is, metropolitan France. And I think we're just beginning to explore that question. And I think the Suzanne's and Williams' essays get us started in thinking about those directions, while at the same time being interested in how the French Revolution has an impact elsewhere. I don't really want to speak for them, since they can speak for themselves here, but I just want to point out the really central things for me about these two incredibly exciting essays. In Suzanne's essay, she's really talking about how the new United States is involved in French ways of thinking about France and experiencing change during the Revolution. What I really love about this essay is it draws attention to the utopian aspect, not just of the French Revolution, but of late 18th century thinking more generally. So what she shows us, I think, is that French thinking is not just French. It involves thinking about other places at the same time, and in this case, the whole Scioto project in Ohio and Kentucky in the United States. And then William Nelson's incredible piece, which is very rich and goes in a lot of different directions, in the end changes our view of what the Enlightenment is about. It shows us a kind of dark side of the Enlightenment, and one might even say, to connect the two pieces, that it shows us the dark side of utopian thinking. So I think there are a lot of really interesting issues here, and rather than go on about them myself, I think we should open the door to other people raising their questions or just offering their comments on these kinds of issues. So Chuck, I turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, while we're waiting for people to get their thoughts together, it's interesting that you raised the question, why now? Why are we interested in global history right now? And I would be interested in your thoughts on how it has something to do with the post-Cold War period, the post-1989 period, where the world is not split into two conceptions of what a good society is supposed to be. Now it's one world.
That's a really, I hadn't really thought of it that way, because to me it seems obvious that it in fact is a creation of the post-Cold War world. Not that globalization is a creation, but the interest in globalization. I've actually done a little work on the use of the word globalization in titles, and there's just no question that this becomes a huge thing in the 1990s and the 2000s. It is not a huge thing before then. So, but I hadn't thought about it in terms of the ending of a kind of dichotomous world and instead thinking about a kind of one world conception. I thought of it more in terms of, well, the way we put together the world was in terms of communism versus capitalism. Now we think about the world in terms of who's in favor of globalization, who's resisting globalization, and how it shapes the world we live in. I don't think it's the only thing that shapes the world we live in, and I don't think the capitalism debate has exactly gone away, but there must be some reason why everyone is so concerned with globalization right now.
Yeah, do we have thoughts on that? Or questions?
Or can anybody even hear what we're saying? That's another question. Go ahead, Chuck.
Yeah, I was going to add that you know, the significance of it's kind of imperialism in reverse, this approach of doing global history by looking at the global factors that go into the French Revolution, because there was something not explicitly imperialist in thinking about the French Revolution as something that imposes itself on the rest of the world, but the implications are that it sort of was. And yeah, I think this hybrid way of looking at but should we be thinking just about the origins of the French Revolution, or extend our analysis even in through the revolution? There were I think it was Norman Hampson. I tried to find the site, but I could be wrong about that. There was an essay written about 20 years ago about how Pitt had all his creatures in Paris in 1793-94 during the period of the Terror, and that actually the politics of the Terror might have something to do with, bribing Danton or, this kind of external influence on the course of the French Revolution. So do you see this as something that can be done before and after?
Yeah, I want to go back to that the first thought you had there, because I think it's a very interesting idea, which is that it's a kind of imperialism in reverse, rather than seeing how the French Revolution affects everybody else, seeing how involvement in the rest of the world affects the French Revolution itself. Yeah, and I think there is something to be said for that. That's kind of the good intention, if you will, of the new interest in globalization. In French history, we're fortunate because many kinds of national history in Europe don't have the connection to the rest of the world necessarily that French and British history does. So I think French and British history have been the most affected by this interest in globalization, in part because we are the best placed to talk about the interrelationships as you've laid them out. I think that's a really interesting point. But what's also interesting is how much resistance there was to thinking in these terms for such a long period of time. The 19th century commentators on the French Revolution saw it as an important global event, but saw no influences globally back upon the French Revolution. Marx, Tocqueville, you name it, they didn't see this connection from that direction. And one could say that for almost the entirety of the 20th century, the same thing was true. I mean, look at the books by Lynn Hunt. Everything I wrote on the French Revolution was about France taken as metropolitan France. I didn't talk about the colonies. I didn't talk about slavery. This interest is very much a product of, it existed before, it's become a much bigger deal in French history in the 1990s and the 2000s than it ever had been before. So one of the things that's really interesting is always, how come we don't see it until a certain moment, and then we see it?
Okay, Suzanne, I think wants to
My doorbell is ringing. I will be right back.
Suzanne, can you hear us? You may need to click your bottom left microphone button.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to address this question of why globalization interests now and how that, and then thinking about it vis-a-vis the French Revolution. It seems to me that one thing that's happened is that there was initially this interest in French history, and I think other fields as well, as looking at kind of colonization going outward from France that was very intense in the 90s. And I think part of the question about globalization has to do with wanting to figure out more how we can figure out how that has impacts back in France. So that's clearly going on. And I also think it probably comes from in this post-Cold War world, the discontent with lack of attention to capitalism and economic history questions. I mean, all of a sudden we have Lynn Hunt, the queen of political culture, doing economic history, but not the Marxist economic history. So I think part of the interest in globalization has to do with a sort of uneasiness with our cultural approach, feeling that it's not answering all of our questions. So there's kind of a reaction on multiple different levels. I mean, if I could just say one thing about my Utopianism piece, I started out writing just about sort of French attitudes towards the United States and all this exciting stuff that came up in pamphlets. And then I started thinking about how it was connected to land and commercial questions only afterwards, partly from questions that people were giving me. Okay, so maybe I'll stop. I can't tell if you can hear me. David, you look like you're...
Yes, no, we can hear you. We can hear you perfectly.
Okay, well, I'll stop.
No, but can I just press Suzanne on the last point that you made? Because I think this is so interesting, which is, it's kind of related to what I was saying before about more generally why we don't see certain things and then all of a sudden we see them. So say a little bit more about how it was you came to see that it had to involve land and commercial speculation.
Well, basically
was it just that your friends were torturing you and saying, well, what about this?
Well, am I on?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. If you want to know specifically who's responsible, it's Jeff Horn was first responsible for saying, hey, this is about land, much more than just about cultural questions. And then I thought, yeah, he's really right. And then Vanessa Schwartz said to me, oh, isn't this about the Atlantic world and issues of how is it connected to the Atlantic world, which I was already thinking about, but not enough. But I think that I had a kind of desire to address the work of people like Edelman, who are talking about the age of revolutions as sort of new forms of imperialism. So I wanted to be able to think about French revolutionary politics in dialogue with recent work on colonization, which inevitably involved economic questions as well as cultural or power questions. So I think, yeah.
Nice. We have a hand. Jeff?
Yes, I actually wanted to address something that Lynn brought up when she said that there was a lot of pushback for a long time about the attempt to globalize the revolution, and I think there still is a lot of pushback. Here at Indiana University, we actually just hired our first faculty member in global history, and he taught a course last spring, and part of what I took away from that was that global historians, one of the things that they do is they try to find historical stories that kind of transcend national boundaries and transcend the state. And so in some sense, if one is to attempt to globalize French history, that might mean taking France away from center stage. And I think part of the pushback is that if one is to write a global history of France, that in some way means incorporating other parts of the world that kind of decentralize France from the story. I'm actually thinking of C.A. Bailey's Birth of the Modern World, where part of his argument is basically that the values in the French Revolution are not specifically French, that kind of revolutionary upheaval happens all over the world at a specific time. I was just wondering what your thoughts on that were.
Well, that's a really interesting question, and actually there's several different questions. I mean, starting with what you first brought up, I mean, one of the issues that we have yet to fully resolve is what does it mean to do global history? I mean, is global history the same thing as transnational history? It's clearly, as you said, in some way transcends nation-state boundaries, but exactly how and how much it has to do that and how best to do that is, I think, very much still on the agenda as a question. The pushback question. Yes, of course there's going to be a certain amount of pushback, but they're actually kind of related questions, because one of the issues is, what's the best way to approach problems? And there's not one best way to approach problems. It partly depends on what you think the problem is. Now, what's interesting about the French Revolution issue is that if you try to talk about, for example, what are the global factors that might have actually influenced the French Revolution, it doesn't seem to me to actually diminish the importance of the French Revolution. It gives it, in some ways you could even say it enhances the importance of the French Revolution, because you show, for example, in both Suzanne's and William's articles, it doesn't seem to me that this makes the French situation less interesting or important. It shows, in William's case, for example, that what is going on with slavery in Saint-Domingue has effects everywhere that anyone is thinking about reforming projects or thinking about population dynamics. Similarly, with Suzanne's article, it shows you that even in the United States, there are relationships between France and the United States that have influences both on American history and on French history. So in some ways, it's showing that there's a greater importance to these events than ever before. So I think the initial pushback on this was in some ways misguided. It was a kind of, oh, then the French Revolution won't be important. Now, Bailey is a really interesting case, I think, because it's a really interesting book. It's an incredibly ambitious book, and it covers, of course, everything in the world. But if you look at it really carefully in terms of what it says about the French Revolution, there's a way in which, though he wants to say it's part of things that are going on similarly in South Asia, similarly in the Middle East in terms of the Persian Empire, there are some parallels, but he himself has to admit there's something about what happens in the French Revolution that has a massive global ramification far beyond just, oh, well, it's just the same kind of thing that's happening elsewhere. It's a similar structural problem about the nature of authority, but it has an impact that is very hard to tie down to just those similar processes about what's going on in the Chinese case or the Persian case or the Ottoman case or whatever. So, interestingly, even in that case, it seems to me he ends up saying, well, the French Revolution ends up having this incredible impact because of the way it mobilizes certain kinds of new ideas about political participation and mobilization.
If I can follow up on that, we have Xiao Wei Cheng, who raises the question or makes the statement that the French Revolution influenced the Chinese Revolution so profoundly in the 20th century. And you actually see that the revolutionary pamphlets, this is fascinating, you actually see that the revolutionary pamphlets, French revolutionary pamphlets, were copied verbatim
Chinese revolutionary pamphlets.
In the Chinese Revolution, including the Declaration of Human Rights. But it is true that only recently historians start to make the connection.
Well, this is the Chinese were, of course, always interested in the French Revolution. In fact, the Chinese revolutionaries were interested in the French Revolution. They had to be because they were interested in the Russian Revolution. And as we know, someone like Trotsky was profoundly interested in what went on in the French Revolution, as was Marx, to figure out what it said about revolution as a model. The Chinese actually have been more on the bandwagon of doing world and global history before we were. They have always approached history from a much more global point of view, and they have always been interested in the spread of French revolutionary ideas around the world, including into the 20th century and the Chinese Revolution. So that's again the model of, wow, the French Revolution is really important. It has this incredible set of waves of influence across the world. We want to also put a focus, as Suzanne mentioned in her comments, on the other side of this, and Chuck, you mentioned this too, of how these events actually shaped the French Revolution as it was happening in the 18th century, because I think that's one of the keys to why the French Revolution has such an impact, because it is drawing on more than just the age-old structural tensions within the French monarchy itself.
Okay. Suzanne has a...
Okay.
Yeah.
I just have a thought about, possible benefits. I mean, one of the things I like about William Nelson's piece is the discussion that he has at the end of the Enlightenment, in which he makes the case that what he's really arguing for is looking at the Enlightenment not as good or bad, but as a kind of generating these complicated contradictions. And in my opinion, one of the possible benefits of global approaches to the French Revolution is helping to explain the complicated mixtures, legacies of the Enlightenment, but also product of revolutionary activities. The mixed legacy, on the one hand, the French Revolution as this democratic revolution, on the other hand, the French Revolution as expansionist and in some way, and trying to colonize in various ways, even as they're liberating. In other words, the ambiguities of the revolution and the contradictions, both the revolution and the Enlightenment, taking the handoff from William, come out. I think some of those are easier to explain or easier to get your hands on, tensions within revolutionary universalism, by looking from a by looking at global impacts or global influences on the revolution itself. So I just also thought that was something very interesting in William's piece.
I think we lost William somewhere along the way, because he doesn't look like he's online.
William Nelson?
Yeah. He was here, you remember, and then he was trying to get his audio working, and I don't...
Yeah.
But there's Mike.
There he is. There he is.
Mike. Go, William.
William, in order to speak, you'll need to click your microphone button in the bottom left of the main screen.
All right. Yeah, so I am definitely here and looking for my place to intervene. Following along.
Okay. You can also, William, hit your transmit button, and then we'll get the video of you.
Okay.
There you are.
There we go.
There you are. There was an element in both Suzanne's and William's piece that I would love to get them to discuss a little bit more, and that's the utopian impulse. Because it seems to me there's clearly William's description of what goes on with these two proto-eugenics thinkers is obviously about a kind of utopian notion that you can shape the population in whatever way you might want to. And Suzanne mentions utopian thinking quite constantly in her article, because and one of the really interesting things I thought in her piece was showing how this utopian strain of thought is not just a bourgeois mode of thought, or much less a working class mode of thought. She shows how artisans, shopkeepers, middle class people, and also liberal nobles are taken up with this kind of utopian thought. So I'd be really interested in the thoughts of the two of you on this utopian element, because many people have decided that this is the problem with the French Revolution. Its association with utopianism.
So I guess I'm connected, so I'll say something first. Yeah, I think it's one of the things that was motivating my the article was thinking about the ways that the utopianism and the kind of attempt to construct, either a specific population or some special community of some sorts is necessarily ambiguous, particularly in kind of a moral sense. There's always, in a sense, this kind of good and bad. And what I was interested in is that particularly ideas around the kind of attempt to construct certain populations could have the same kind of fundamental ideas that they're built on. The kind of foundational ideas could have very different readings and very different kind of implications. And I found it very interesting that particularly the two plans relating to Saint-Domingue, although neither one of them is something that is we would look at as positive, but they have very different approaches to the question of something like the variety of peoples, of what they're starting to see as race, and whether there should be a kind of an improvement, a mixing of peoples, or a separation and a kind of creation of these categories of distinction and differentiation. And I found it very interesting that, and I think it kind of stands for a lot of the impulses and ideas of the Enlightenment, that the same kind of fundamental idea or set of ideas can be translated or taken in rather different directions. You know, ones that in theory could lead towards some kind of more, you know, a community that would, in terms of race, would have a greater amount of kind of appreciation for kind of mixing and difference in some general sense, or one that was kind of attempting to create these very rigid boundaries. And both of these ideas are being built on the same kind of fundamental core. And so it relates to a lot of fundamental, or to kind of utopian projects in the Enlightenment and the Revolution, which as well have these, you know, these very kind of ambiguous or ambivalent effects that go in both directions.
So, William, in your piece, you talk about people who actually have an experience of Saint-Domingue. So, do you think in France there is the same kind? Is this sort of thinking about race something that's going on in the colonies, or is it also going on in France?
No, it's going on in France. I mean, I think that's one of the interesting things, and one of the things I've continued in trying to take this a little bit farther, is seeing the ways that it's, you know, it's certainly not a kind of one-way mode of transmission. You know, ideas that are developed in France start to be applied in the colonies. There's always this kind of back and forth, and there are, particularly when you look in the later periods, just before the revolution in the 80s, and then in the revolution itself, there's a number of eugenic ideas, for instance, that are building on developments in the colonies in ways. So there's this kind of circularity. So there was always this kind of racial thinking in France, but as well these ideas that are developing through the application in the colonies are being kind of brought back and reintroduced in ways. And I think one of the examples from a little bit earlier that has been written about, really interesting, are the Police de Noir regulations, the regulations that were intended to regulate all of the people of color, particularly black people in France, and to create the system of identification and eliminate them from metropolitan France. And in a lot of ways, these practices, the set of laws or regulations, is very clearly building upon regulations and instruments of surveillance, identity cards, this kind of thing, that are developed in the colonies. So there's a very interesting way that there's a back and forth.
We have a question. Unless someone wants to pick up on that point, I would suggest we turn to a question in the chat box from Nicholas Pellegrino. I'm curious to know what everyone thinks about traditional Marxist approaches to the revolution and how that changed during the critical period in the early 1990s until today. Does globalization as a theoretical model supplant the Marxist approach after the revisionist attack in the 1960s and 1970s, or is there still room for a Marxist interpretation within the globalization model?
Well, I'll take this on first and then pass it off to Suzanne and William, because I'm sure they have things to say about this too. I don't think that globalization as a theoretical model necessarily supplants the Marxist approach, but I think that one reason why there's an interest now in the globalization question is because the old debates between capitalism and communism more generally, and in particular the debates between the Marxist interpretation of the French Revolution and the revisionist critique, had reached a kind of dead end. But I think it's also related, in the case of the French Revolution, I think it's also related to a point that Suzanne brought up much more forcefully, which is a kind of dissatisfaction with cultural interpretations and interpretations that emphasize political culture, and wanting to bring back in the social and the economic without just having it be, are you a Marxist or not a Marxist? Are you a Marxist or are you a revisionist? It's a way of saying, let's bring back in the social and economic, but without it having to be associated with one particular point of view. That said, I mean, I think this is, in the globalization debates that are going on right now, there is a very strong Marxist element, which is, of course, critical of globalization as simply the latest form of capitalist modernization, and to be resisted for some of the same reasons that modernization was resisted in the past. So I don't think that Marxism is, it's not that I want to say that Marxism is passé or that it's not relevant to the debates, but I think within the question of interpretations of the French Revolution, this is globalization. The interest in globalization will not be just going back to, was it a bourgeois revolution or not? I think it will be a different kind of perspective than one of which social class is really important, or is it really about social class? Because that was still within France as the nation-state model. The globalization approach is to broaden that out and ask the question in different kinds of ways.
Yeah.
Suzanne,
Xiaowei Cheng made the comment. He asked the question about, or she, I'm not sure, was asking the question about the Chinese Revolution, and wanted to clarify that the question being raised was the 1911 revolution in China, not the Cultural Revolution of the mid-20th century.
Right. Good point.
Yeah.
Good point.
And we have a hand, and then we have a comment. Why don't we take the hand first? We have, Suzanne. Sorry.
Suzanne, you need to click your microphone button on the bottom left of the main screen. There you go.
I'm in. Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting question of what happens to the Marxist interpretation under globalization. And what I'm hoping happens is that I think this is already happening in work on the Atlantic world, that what it does is it brings back in questions about about political responses to socioeconomic issues, but without putting them in a Marxist framework. If I could give the example of, for example, Chuck Walton has been working on the Eden Treaty between France and England, and showing how it has very distinct socioeconomic impacts on various merchant groups within France, who then become politicized as a result. But he's not framing that in terms of a bourgeois versus noble framework. So I think what's going to happen through work on globalization and the Atlantic world is people posing all kinds of questions about the social impact in conjunction with questions about commerce and colonization and the new global economy, so that the connection between the social and the economic and politics gets new value, but not within a Marxist framework. So I think that's what's happening.
Yeah, perhaps if I may intervene just for a second, and perhaps what we're moving towards is not a model in which the political is a sphere and then the socioeconomic is a sphere, that one has to be reduced to the other, but we're looking at the complicated ways that the two interrelate with each other, and perhaps even we'll get to the point where we can see in this period of the late 18th century the creation of the political as a conceptual model and the socioeconomic as a conceptual model, but that really what's going on in terms of power and how power works, society, the economy, and power are all mixed up and intertwined.
Right, although, to defend slightly a Marxist point of view, we don't want to just get to a position where it's just complicated. And one of the great virtues of Marxism was it took what was very complicated and made it into a much more schematic model by which you could understand what was coming in the future. And that's an element that I'm not sure we want to give up entirely. So I think, it still remains to be seen. This is just the beginning of work that's being undertaken in this point of view, and I'm not sure that anyone knows yet what kind of alternative interpretation of the French Revolution is going to result, or whether there's going to be a kind of alternative meta-narrative about the meaning of modern history that's going to result. This is all up in the air. But one of the problems with the revisionist point of view originally, not so much in its Fourier and post-Fourier stage, but originally it was built mainly on critique of Marxism. The Marxist interpretation couldn't explain why middle-class elements were fighting each other during the revolution, as opposed to offering actually an alternative explanation. One of the great things about Fourier's interpretation was it offered an alternative that said it was about ideology, it was about language, it was about politics. Now the question is, well, what are we going to offer instead of these very powerful models that we have some dissatisfactions with?
Yeah. Katie Jarvis says that, she doesn't have a question. She had a comment a while ago, but she couldn't type fast enough it is, okay.
Zhao Wei Zheng is obviously a better typer.
I'm going to run through here. I may have, want to make sure I haven't missed anyone in the chat box, because it's a small little box, and it, okay, no, okay.
Well, Lynn, I'll ask a question.
Okay.
Sure, go ahead, David.
I'm only half paying attention, I must admit, because
I know you're too busy looking at the buttons, seeing what's happening, right?
But
okay.
I mean, to what degree can I don't even want to call it a neo-Marxist, but a revised Marxist version be brought in and be tied into the globalization perspective?
Well, I mean, what I'm really just remarking on is the fact that many of the powerful critiques of globalization, and certainly of the economic crisis of 2008, which is probably not over, but of the ongoing economic crisis, have been written by people with a kind of strong Marxist leaning, because they were interested in what are the structural problems of the world economy in a period of globalization that would explain why there is going to be a crisis. I'm thinking, for example, of David Harvey, who's written some very good things, and actually I happened to see online, I'm sure it's probably available on YouTube, an incredible cartoon that was done by him explaining the economic crisis in Marxist terms for a kind of general audience. So what I'm saying is that, first of all, the Marxist critique of the current economic crisis has been quite powerful, saying it has to do with contradictions within capitalism itself. One of the arguments that he made that has had influence actually on my own work was that the crisis was caused by the fact that there's actually too much capital with no place for it to go. A kind of lack of confidence in investment, a lack of confidence in the stock market, and therefore there's, it's not like there's a lack of capital. We see this right now in the economic crisis. The banks have lots of money. They won't give it to anybody. So he's interested in, why does that happen? So if you apply that to the French Revolution, in my own current work, one of the things I've been interested in is, well, economically, what's the problem of the French monarchy on the eve of 1789? It doesn't seem that it actually is the size of the deficit. It has to do more with the way finances are administered in France. There's not a lack of capital. There may even be too much capital. It's a question of how the capital is mobilized. And so in that sense, it seems to me that it's not that I don't want to take the position of that Marxism is just finished, because the idea that there is a structural analysis of the economy to be undertaken is still a very powerful idea. Now, it's not necessarily a Marxist idea, but as Suzanne mentioned in her original remarks, we can't ignore society, economics, finances, and expect. I think one of the dissatisfactions with the Fourier-style interpretation was that it's not just ideology and politics. That to understand political problems, you have to also look at the broader context. So that's what I mean by how a Marxist inflected interpretation might still have some significance.
Yeah.
But that wasn't meant to end the conversation.
Well, a theorist that springs to mind who moves in the direction of Marxism, when he was young, he was a Marxist, and then he moved away from that, but who has an interesting way of bringing the political, social, and economic together in a way is Karl Polanyi, The Great Transformation.
Yes, sure.
And I think it's time it might be a good time to revisit what his interpretation and apply it to the French Revolution.
Well, okay, but say more. That's very provocative, Chuck, but exactly what would that mean?
Well, I mean, he draws on the theoretical literature that comes out of cultural anthropology, and especially Marcel Maus's The Gift and Gift Exchange. And one way of thinking about how societies are structured is that hierarchies, people who have power in society have that power because, and this is hard for us to believe now, but because after 30 years of our economic ideology, but they have power because they redistribute. Whether you're, an African tribe or you're Louis XIV, if you don't give out goodies, you don't have friends. If you don't have friends, you're going to have potential rebellion. And so there was always a way that redistribution as a mechanism of creating alliances in society worked in the early modern and old regime. Of course, Louis XIV didn't give equally to everyone. That's why it was a hierarchical society, and coercion and ideology entered into the equation to explain to people or force people to accept that they're not going to get as much as others. But republicanism opens up this whole issue anew, because republicanism raises the question of potential equality. Okay, fine. So now if we have potential equality, who gives what to whom? Who has power? How do you maintain that power through redistributive mechanisms? Should you maintain power through redistribution, or should we forget the redistribution game entirely and elevate this thing called the market and the economy as the place where you get your goodies in society, and politics is about something else? So these ideas, I think, kind of come out of Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation. And I think it's a powerful model for interpreting what's going on in the, I added to it. That's not exactly what he says, but I built upon some of his ideas there. But that might be a way of interpreting, bringing the economy, society, and politics together.
I think that's an incredibly interesting idea that you're laying out there, Chuck. I'm really incredibly interesting. It's hard not to immediately jump, not necessarily to the French Revolution, but to current day political and economic dilemmas that have to do with, which one thing you didn't mention is that you're absolutely right that there's a kind of transformation from this kind of kingly redistributive structure during the old regime to what republicanism is supposed to mean, and people are not quite sure how that is supposed to work. But what's fascinating is that there's then a third element that gets introduced that is now still an incredibly important source of tension, and that's the clientage form, which is actually neither Republican nor the sort of kingly, I'm the one who gives out the goodies thing. Clientage is built on the first, but has elements of the second, and is yet a third form. And what we've seen in the modern political world is that it's a very powerful form. And one could say that one of the things that goes on in the revolution is a kind of trying to figure out what the Republican model is supposed to mean. Is it supposed to veer towards the clientage system, which of course is what Napoleon will introduce the most successfully? He solves these problems by establishing clientage as a system, though he's himself kind of torn between the two. But I think that's a really, really powerful model. The thing is about the revolutionaries, it's not clear to me how much they understood republicanism in those terms. In quite such clear-cut terms as you're laying out. Do you have thoughts on that?
I think that's part of what the problem was, is that republicanism never came to terms with distributive justice. Who gets what in society? And there were competing versions. There was the Girondin economic liberalism model, and then there were social models. even social and economic rights.
Right.
As we know, they didn't make it into the 1789 Declaration of Rights, but they made it into most of the proposals, more than half of the proposals in the summer of 1789. So republicanism is kind of undecided, and that could explain a lot of why it radicalizes. Republicanism can't come to terms with, or can't create a consensus on what's distributive justice or how it's supposed to function in the regime. I think Mike Sonnenscheer tries to get at some of these issues on an intellectual historical way in his Sans Culottes book.
Right, but the thing is also it's not just the Republicans, as you are perfectly well aware, who are having trouble figuring out how it's supposed to work. I think one of the real tensions is that the population is not ready for the radical switch from what had been the previous model, deference in exchange for a certain amount of redistribution from above, to a theoretically egalitarian model where everyone's going to pay taxes and they're going to get back things in terms of what the state determines to be their needs. As we've learned, looking at the current economic crisis, it's not like the general population in most places is bought into this model yet.
Yeah, that's right. It's an ongoing problem at the heart of democracy, I guess, in a way.
Right.
Yeah, but I'm struck that some of this is going to come back to not simply ideology, which would push off to a more revisionist approach, but some of it is also going to tie to political practice and looking back at the old regime throughout, especially from, say, the 1730s on, and trying to figure out what political practices are people being accustomed to in their daily activities and in their daily lives, and how is that creating tensions between this hierarchical model that's being sustained coming out of the late reign of Louis XIV and new types of administrative agencies, new types of market structures that are giving them an experience of something that's more egalitarian. And that type of political practice strikes me is as equally as important as these intellectual contradictions in creating confusion about where people think that this thing should go as it starts to be transformed.
Right, and that links back actually to William's article, because one of the things that's going on at the same time is also new expectations about what the state can accomplish and how it can intervene to shape these things. And his two guys, who frankly seem to me to be a little nutcase-like in their views, nevertheless, in their nutcase-like way, showed that there was this kind of underlying issue as well, which is, well, maybe if the state could study things enough and develop enough information and develop a kind of program of what it wanted to achieve, it could actually intervene and shape the population itself for the future. So it's not just, I agree, David, that it's political practices very much on the most local levels, but it's also new ideas about what the state can accomplish that's happening at the same time. What this is, again, part of the tension in republicanism is, in this period, is that it's being pulled in all the different directions. What can be accomplished locally and what can be accomplished by the state, and they're sort of in the middle trying to negotiate between these things.
Okay, I think we have to hear from William on his nutcases.
I concur. They are. I think that's one of the things that's most interesting about their plans is the way that they are being built upon certain ideas and taking them to places that are entirely impractical. So they're this kind of what they're proposing the state could do is so far removed from what is possible to achieve in a colony like Saint-Domingue. The idea that the slave population of, at that point, 80 to 90% of the island would somehow be able to be kind of, as well as the free colored population would be able to be kind of forced into any kind of coercive breeding project like that. It seemed, it's so far beyond what would be possible if you just think about the numbers of people that would have to be involved, the numbers of, the amount of money, all of these things on the ground. It's just not even close to possible.
Right, but can I just interject here? I mean, the thing that's so interesting about Saint-Domingue, it's not the same as Suzanne's Kyoto case exactly, which means the U.S. as a kind of place to think about. But think of what happens to Saint-Domingue in a relatively short period of time.
Yeah.
They invade this island. Most of the natives are killed off one way or the other, and this entire ecology is completely transformed by the transportation of people across staggering distances to repopulate this part of the island and become a staggering engine of economic growth. So they had seen in Saint-Domingue,
that's true,
in a sense, a kind of utopian project whose scale no one would have been silly enough to think of ahead of time. And you know, if you looked at the situation in the 1780s with the 450,000 people on this island, most of them slaves, doing this industry that the French weren't even doing 100 years before, it's pretty staggering.
Yeah, if I could say something about that, I think that's true, and I think that's one of the things that studying the colonies has to offer. You know, also if we're looking at France, bringing the colonies into the picture as well, we see that the colonies oftentimes are functioning like these laboratories where they're achieving things that maybe beforehand they wouldn't have thought possible, and as well are willing to experiment oftentimes for these horrible reasons, right? That they have a slave population who, you know, they feel that they can use instrumentally and all of these kinds of these reasons, but they nonetheless are able to, or they feel that it's possible to execute certain plans that they wouldn't be able to back in France. Right. And that then these ideas, because of this possibility, as they conceive it, it's a possibility in Saint-Domingue, it gets kind of articulated, and once it becomes articulated is then something that is taken up in France and kind of has an effect in some ways there as well. So that's part of the kind of circularity I think I was talking about earlier. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, one could argue that the whole French notion that the state has a staggering amount of power and can intervene in important ways to shape life, one could argue this comes in some measure out of the 18th century colonial experience.
Oh, yeah, certainly.
Yeah. No, this is, I mean, that's what I really liked about your essay, William, is the way that you show how, you know, the experience of bringing different populations together outside of France inflects the way Enlightenment imagines. And I think, and also the way it thinks, that tension between. I think one of the things we can build on from your work and go even further is to look at that tension between new hierarchies, the experience of bringing people together, and then you have a revolution which changes the terms of social hierarchy, and they're groping to find ways to recreate them. It's good. We have a question here from Nicholas Pellegrino. Given the global turn French revolutionary historiography has taken, does anyone see new ways to link the causes or even the consequences of the American and French revolutions? Should we be looking at those two revolutions differently, or their relationship, or compare them differently in light of where we're going with global history?
Well, Chuck, you mentioned before the work of Michael Sonnenscherer. I think one of the things that I take away from the previous book to the Sans-Culotte book is the incredible importance of the public debt in all of these situations in the 18th century. And I would say it's not just the American Revolution and the French Revolution, which we can talk about in a little bit more detail, but it also involves issues like the Dutch Revolt of 1787 is very much involved with this as well. So one of the big 18th century issues is, what is the public debt going to be like, and how is it going to be funded? And I'm sorry, my phone is ringing. I've unplugged it in my office, but it's, you can still hear it in the background. fortunately, it's only going to ring one more time. So going along with this issue about redistribution that Chuck brought up before, the underlying issue to that also is there going to be a national debt? And if there's going to be a national debt, how's a national debt going to be funded? And what does it represent to have a national debt? And in that sense, the American and the French revolutions are very interesting because they pose this question in starkly different ways. The problem that the Americans have is that there's no way they can fund the debt themselves to start with, because there's no, the banking system is very rudimentary, etc. So I think there's a link between the two revolutions in that way. And I think in that sense, the sort of global banking system, if you will, is a way of linking the American and French revolutions, not in terms perhaps of its immediate causes. The Americans don't revolt because of their debt, because they don't actually have a debt until they have revolted. But it's a problem that they face in common with it, because their debt until they revolt is the British debt. So they don't have a problem. But they do have a problem the minute they do declare independence, in trying to find people who will pay for not only the war, but who will then pay to set up an entirely new state. So that perspective has not really been developed much, and I think it's one that historians need to pay more attention to, which is what are the consequences of having a national debt, especially a national debt that's funded by the taxation system of the country in question. And that goes right back to Chuck's initial point about redistribution, because that's what taxes are about.
Another.
If I could just also answer or speak to the Nicholas Pellegrino question. In the Kyoto piece, one of the things that I was trying to do was to look at some of the origins of the competition between France and the U.S. over the claim to be kind of the model of modern moral politics. And I think, certainly it's been true in American historiography trying to embrace a global turn, and presumably in French too, is to kind of expose this whole discourse of exceptionalism about both the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and kind of put those things in perspective. So I think that's one consequence of this new historiography. I also think that in thinking about how this global historiography has links consequences of the Americans and French revolutions, the people who have tried to rethink the revolutionary era in terms of an imperial crisis, as well as the turn in American history towards looking at the conquest of the American West as this process of colonization, have I think those different approaches have created a space for French revolutionary historians to think about how both the American Revolution and the French Revolution lead to transformations in the nature of colonialism. So that, it used to be that comparing the American and French Revolution was done in the framework of why does the American Revolution succeed and why does the French Revolution fail. So I think one of the new sets of questions that emerges is, why did the American and French Revolutions create these different kinds of colonialism? The American expansionism, and then French revolutionary expansionism, leading to the sister republics, leading then to Napoleon's empire. So I think the people working on Napoleon have been trying to be in dialogue with the work on imperialism, but I think that's going to increase. So I see that as one of the possible results of the globalization turn, is rethinking how these two revolutions had consequences regarding colonization and new forms of imperialism.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Two people's work to keep your eye on, who are Jennifer Sessions' work that looks at the history of French colonialism in Algeria, but how it grows out of the imperial experience of Napoleon. So Jennifer Sessions is one person to keep your eye on who's addressing those kinds of issues. And then Pierre Serna, I think, has an interesting thesis that he's putting together about how, France was through and through it was structured, even at the level of the metropole, was structured on an imperial basis. So, Languedoc and Saint-Domingue were somewhat subject to similar processes. So, yeah, those are good points.
Yeah, and a comment linking back to Nick's question about causes. Now, one of the things, or one of the consequences of the American Revolution as of 1776 is that it opens up the American market to the sugar planters in Saint-Domingue. And you see an acceleration in the inflow of slaves into Saint-Domingue in that time period in the very late 70s and into early 80s. So there's some direct connections there in terms of the types of economic pressures that are coming to bear in Saint-Domingue. And, by, 1788, you've got 40,000 slaves coming into Saint-Domingue in a single year. So that you do have some real effects, or some real pressures that are growing in that society, drawing out of these connections with the American Revolution.
Right, but so one of the really interesting issues still is to figure out what kind of impact do these developments have back in France? Because should we, as it were, take them at their word and only discuss it when the revolutionaries themselves bring it up, or is it something that's more underneath the surface in the way that William is suggesting in his piece, for example, that underneath the surface of the Enlightenment as we know it is a whole other kind of way of thinking about these issues that we also need to take into consideration. That's the exciting thing about this globalization perspective, is it just gets us to think in new ways about old problems.
Yeah. And even come up with new problems. Yeah. Yeah.
So that French history is not going out of business. Yes.
Yeah. There was a comment earlier, maybe it was this one, that made me think about, is comparative history still a separate genre? Does the fact that we're doing that more and more people are doing French global history make us rethink what comparative history is all about? Or will comparative history become somewhat passé as we start to see that everything's interconnected?
Well, I mean, Suzanne should probably answer that question more, because she jumped in about the United States and France in a way that I was reluctant to do so. But first of all, I mean, you'd have to admit, I think, that comparative history actually never really took off. Comparative history is extremely difficult to do if you mean you're doing two different places equally. The attraction, I think, of transnational history or global history, as I understand it, which is more transnational history, is that it allows you to study, for example, a commodity or the movements of peoples of a particular kind, and you aren't actually having to do British and French history or French history and American history, because it's very difficult if you're talking about two places like those that have immense historiographies all of their own. So the advantage of the transnationals in a way is that you get away from having to know everything about the United States and France to a more specific question, such as, well, in the case, for example, of Suzanne's article, she's talking about a kind of very specific link about land in a certain part of the United States and its relationship to the French imagination of what politics and society and economics should all be about. That's a lot easier to do than let's compare the American Revolution and the French Revolution, which would require you to master. There's no way I can keep up with the historiography of the French Revolution and do anything else with my life, because there's gazillions of things written in just that. So the comparative, I think, never really took off for that reason. And the transnational is a way of posing the questions in a different kind of way that is, in fact, manageable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good point.
I think one of the things that's can I go ahead and speak without raising my hand? What I was going to say is, I think one of the things that's happening is that there's comparative history going on where is that the turn toward globalization has reframed the questions that cause you to think, oh, they're asking that question about, say, the Iberian world and revolution there. They don't apply to what I'm thinking about exactly, but they're causing me to rejuggle my thinking about it. So it's not exactly transnational, and it's not exactly point-by-point comparison. But I think this is the kind of thing I was talking about in trying to respond to the question about the American and French revolutions, that because you have this globalization frame and all this thinking about how the revolutions are intertwined with the revolutions and the Enlightenment, thinking of Williams' article, are intertwined with question of colonization. It's not exactly comparative, but thinking about other places causes you to rethink your own place and make sort of implicit comparisons that is really healthy without having to do what Lynn is talking about, learning absolutely everything about absolutely everywhere.
Right. No, I think that's a very good point. And the way you've been bringing up the Edelman idea about the realignment of empires after the American and French revolutions, I think that's absolutely right. That's an incredibly fruitful way of going about doing this, which is and often it has to be posed by somebody who's completely outside of your own frame of reference. I mean, one of the things that struck me in the things I've been doing lately is how little attention we French historians pay to the kind of thing that's interesting to Chuck, the relationships between France and Britain on specific issues, not a comparative history, but on specific issues, and also the relationship between France and Spain. We sort of act as if France has nothing to do, that Spain has nothing to do with France, even though it's in fact the same ruling family until the French Revolution. And they are extremely close interrelationships, and the French economy is very much tied into the Spanish economy. And because of the nation-state emphasis that we've all been sort of schooled in doing our work, you're starting to think about that. So now that there's interesting work being done on the Spanish Empire, it gets us to rethink our own questions in these new ways that Suzanne is pointing out. I think it's really great.
We have a question from Ian Milk. Given works like Rosenwein's The Emotional Communities, do you think this changes the use of comparative histories of early modern revolutions? So, does this book, Emotional Communities, help us think about or compare different revolutions?
Well, Rosenwein's work really isn't so much germane, it seems to me, to comparative histories of early modern revolutions as much as it's a different kind of question that's extremely interesting and very much relevant to the kind of thing that Chuck was talking about before with redistributive economies. That is, she's talking about the way in which a community regulates the expression of emotion, which also ends up being about the regulation of the expression of violence, since that's one of the things that emotion is closely related to, though not exclusively related to. So what she's doing is it's a very different kind of question, but I think it's a very helpful one. You can see the results of that kind of thinking, for example, in Bill Reddy's book called The Navigation of Feeling, which is about how the regulation of emotion works out in the French Revolution itself. So I think it's more that it asks us to look at our questions in a different kind of way. Instead of looking at class, for example, if you follow Rosenwein, you'll look more at how a community sets up inherent rules about a culture about the way emotional expression should take place. And that's obviously very important in politics, and it's very important in war, and it's very important in just the regulation of violence within communities. But I don't see it so much as being about Britain versus France, because one of the things she's talking about in the medieval period is that a community is not necessarily defined as coterminous with the nation state. It's sometimes smaller and sometimes broader. And that's, in that sense, it's related to the globalization issue, which is, let's not think the nation state is the natural unit for our analysis.
So maybe we shouldn't use the term transnational, we should use the term supranational, because transnational still reifies that there are two nations interacting with each other, or it's above these nation states, and
right.
Supranational leaves the nation states in a more destabilized kind of analytical state, so to speak.
That's why there's been so much, but there's been so much debate about what the right term is for exactly these kinds of reasons. We want to talk about something that crosses the national boundary, but we're not quite sure what the right way to talk about it is.
Yeah.
But I think there's no denying that globalization as a term is a much more common term than, transnationalization or some other term.
Right. We have a question from Rebecca.
Rebecca, you need to click your microphone button at the bottom.
I think I did. Can you hear me?
There, you're here.
Okay. I kind of, started thinking about this question at the beginning of the webinar, but we were talking about the ideas and effects of the French Revolution going out of France. And I'm sorry if this is taking us a step back or two, but I was just wondering how studying the influences, potential influences of revolution coming into France in the beginning of the 18th century, the study of that subject would look different than the study of the dissemination of the actual event. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, Chuck, since you understood what the question was, I think you should answer it.
No, I mean, the question was more focused on inputs into leading up to the revolution rather than outputs, but if I heard you correctly, Rebecca, you talked about the early 18th century. So thinking about the French Revolution's origins as somehow growing out of global or external influences that go back further than, say, the kinds of immediate, 10 years leading up to the revolution kinds of influences. So, I mean, Newton and Locke spring to mind, and Anglomania spring to mind, and I know Andrew Janshill is working on how the French appropriate British or English constitutionalism in the early to mid 18th century. But do you have thoughts? Any of you?
Oh, I thought you were asking Rebecca if she had thoughts. Yeah, I think what you said, Chuck, brings attention to something that I've always found, and I still find, despite Andrew's work, a little bit mysterious, and that is, how it is the French in 1792 are able to talk themselves into the idea that they're going to have a republic. I mean, clearly this is partly to do, it seems to me, partly to do with the influence of the United States, partly to do with the influence of all these ideas that are circulating, but we still don't have a really, really good sense of how this comes together and it manages to galvanize basically a huge portion of the deputies in 1792 when they've had no experience of it, except in what they've seen around them, the Swiss, the Dutch, the Americans, all of whom are infinitely smaller not territorially in the case of the Americans, but in terms of population, or in the case of the European examples, in terms of their size. And how they make this mental leap has always seemed something of a mystery to me.
Mm.
It must have to do with these other influences that we just haven't been able to kind of trace because they're not quantifiable or whatever.
Yeah, no, it is. Could one make the argument that they didn't decide it so much as it happened, that events spun out of control? They wanted to, perhaps revolutionaries wanted to exploit, put pressure on the king and neutralize the king, but actually to I don't know, were the majority of deputies in the national the Legislative Assembly on August 10, 1792, in the morning, did the majority want a republic?
Right. Well, that's no. I think I think it's a good point. I mean, I think there's no question that the events do overtake them, but they're obviously prepared to think in these terms.
They have, and they have the conceptual resources to put a republic together within a month. Yeah.
Within a month, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So.
Chuck, we have a follow-up question.
Yes.
From Ian Nelk over in the chat box.
Okay. Yes, I'm scrolling here. Neither. Okay.
I don't think it's really a question.
I don't think it's a question. It's about the webcam and microphone.
No, right above that.
Oh, right above it. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay. Taking out the idea of the nation state, would it then be possible to compare emotional communities of different cultures experiencing revolution within the same period? So if I understand Ian correctly, the question, take the nation state out, can we identify emotional communities and then proceed to examine them in terms of how they're experiencing revolution?
Well, right. I mean, the issue would be what's the unit you want to talk about? I mean, how to identify emotional communities. Presumably, one is not talking about the difference between Americans in the new United States and the French in France. I mean, there's certainly much still to be said about the different ways in which communities in France reacted to what was going on. We still don't know that much about it, despite the efforts of someone like, say, who I've always deeply admired, the efforts of someone like Richard Cobb to get at what ordinary individuals are thinking. We don't. It's not exactly clear how we would get at this, the emotional community aspect, and how we would define the communities in question. But I think there are things to be done there, and there are some people who are beginning to work on this, but not so much for the French Revolution. There's more for the late 19th century in French history that people have been working more on this. But certainly one of the issues that occurs during the Revolution is how to negotiate what is obviously meant to be a major transformation in the way people experience the world, going from a monarchy to a republic. This is not just a question of the form of government, it's a question of how people feel in certain kinds of situations, and what they're meant to feel, and what kinds of new feelings they have, and how the regulation of feeling is going to take place in this rapidly changing set of events.
Yeah, Michelle Wang has a comment over here in the chat box I want to use to draw out on that, where he says certain ideas just have universal appeal. And I guess a question I would have, as we globalize the French Revolution, does that enhance its universalistic aspects, or does it in some way normalize them? Does it challenge the sense of universal ideas that the revolution is confronting and dealing with?
Well, I'm sure other people have just as much to say on this than I do, but I think one of the real positive prospects of this interest in a more global approach is precisely to understand how the French got this kind of bug of universalism, if you will, in part from their conversation, their dialogues, their interactions with other places and other peoples. In other words, I think people want to get away from the classic Tocquevillian explanation, which was that French universalism was peculiarly French, and it came out of the peculiarities of the French system, in particular the way that the absolutist kings leveled the differences between people within France and then set up an appeal made it possible to appeal, therefore, to these more universal ideals. I think now we want to understand this universalism as having much more to do with French interaction with other parts of the world, not just its own colonies, but other parts of the world as well, and that this very universalist idea was not just peculiarly French, but was in the air and was mobilized in certain ways in the French Revolution that gave it then a universal appeal. So, for me, myself personally, one of the fascinating things was, what are they thinking when they do the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and they never make a reference to France? It's an entirely universalist document, written at an extremely particular moment in French history. How does that happen? That clearly happens because they're in contact with a set of universal ideas that are ambient in the Atlantic world, and even more generally than that in Europe as well, and also because their experiences in different parts of the world have given them the sense that these universal ideas can make sense. In other words, I think we want to get the universalism of the French Revolution then can be explained more in global terms and not just peculiarly French terms.
Suzanne, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay. Yeah, thinking about what Lynn the issues Lynn just raised, I recall you giving a talk about kloots and about citizenship, about the including, you were working on some of these issues, right, about how foreigners become citizens or become included in the French Revolution, and how that helps the revolution actualize its universality?
I have argued, or I am arguing, that in constructing revolutionary universalism, the revolutionaries are not only not just drawing on French ideas, as Lynn is saying, they're not just drawing on universalist rights ideology, but they're also, their attempt to construct universalism is directly connected to trying to figure out how to incorporate foreigners into the French Republic, and how to figure out an ideology that is legitimate in ways that are tied to their attempt to sort of spread revolution abroad. In other words, that figuring out universalism, there's so many different layers. I'm also thinking back to what the comment about emotional communities. It's clear that the way the French conceptualize universalism is based on the assumption that certain emotional communities are going to exist, and I think it would be quite possible to define emotional communities not at all by national boundaries, but by kind of political emotional boundaries, looking at groups of, radicals expecting Republican politics to take a certain form. I've kind of gotten off of universalism, but I was thinking about that before with Ian's question about emotional communities, transnational emotional communities, or global communities.
Chuck, we are just about out of time.
Yes.
Yes, we are. Well, I think it's time to thank everyone for participating. Lynn, William, Susan, and Suzanne, and David. Thank you for organizing this.
And we can all give Lynn a round of applause by clicking our applause button that's over by the raising hand button.
Oh yeah.
Oh, there it is.
I'm applauding myself. Yeah. Try to see if it worked.
Chuck, do you want to say something about the next webinar?
Yes. We will have Julian Jackson of Queen Mary University in London joining us and running the seminar, which will focus on 1968.
Wow.
So we're maintaining the theme of revolution, but we're moving it into the 20th century.
And do you remember the date on that?
No, I don't.
Is it in March? I've forgotten too.
No, I think it's in early April, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
That's great. And also, David, wouldn't it be good to get some feedback from all of our participants about what they thought, what could be improved, what sorts of things would help them?
Absolutely, which is why I have my email address on the whiteboard screen right now. And I would very much appreciate receiving feedback from any and all of you about what we can do better, how we can organize the webinars better. This is a tradition we'd like to continue for the foreseeable future.
Great, terrific.
Well,
right,
thank you.
And thanks to all those who signed in and listened in, and especially those who asked questions.
Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you all,
Okay.
and we'll be shutting you down.
All right, thanks, Dave.
Okay, take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.